Thanks for having me here. I'm Jeff Seidman, neutral reset. I teach at Vassar College, but the reason I'm here is that a couple of years ago, there was a proposal in the town of Poughkeepsie, where I live, for a grid scale battery energy storage system. And people in the town and on the town board were alarmed and concerned. They, didn't know much about these, but they Googled them and they found what you will find if you Google them, which is really scary pictures of fires shooting up into the air and articles mentioning the names of toxic chemicals that you do not want to breathe and you do not want to have in your town. And so the town board moved to impose a moratorium, initially 6 months, but then it was renewed twice, because people said this feels like a danger and a risk to the health and safety of our community, and I don't want it. Like, why should we have this here? As the person introducing me said, my background is in philosophy, but I also teach courses now. I've been studying for a number of years on the energy system in our environmental studies program at Vassar. And so I know something about these things. On the one hand, I know something about the role that these can play, or increasingly playing, in the electrical system, the energy system more broadly. And secondly, I knew enough, now I'm just giving you an opinion, but I'll state something more to put some evidence behind this opinion later on, to know that although the concerns and the fears that people have are very reasonably motivated, absolute respect for people who want to protect their families and their town from dangers, they are not based in real evidence. They are out of all proportion to the danger that these things impose. The danger that these impose is less than the risk of technologies that we live with happily every single day. So I'll try to say something about that toward the end of my talk. So what I'm going to do is share with you some of what I shared with my town. So I worked over 18 months to inform my community and my town board about what I know. And at the end of 18 months, my town board felt comfortable making an evidence-based decision. And they reversed the moratorium that they had imposed, and they put in place a zoning law enabling battery systems in the town of Poughkeepsie. So I'm going to tell you what I told them, or part of what I told them, given the time, and then you can ask questions or do what you will with it. So the way I want to start by framing this is just, why are we talking about this all of a sudden? I'm not sure to what extent this is true in Orange County, but certainly in Dutchess County and in Ulster County, just in the last few years, it seems like every other town, a proposal for a big battery storage system is popping up. And that wasn't the case 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. So why all of a sudden are we talking about these things? So let me start by narrowing the focus a little bit. So I'm going to talk about utility scale or grid scale batteries, like you see on the right. Okay. So these are these big things that look like shipping containers. They're not shipping containers, but they are the same general shape. And they are almost always located next to an existing electrical substation along a high voltage transmission line. They can also be co-located with a solar farm, or not so likely in the Hudson Valley, but a wind farm. And that's a really important use case. So in the case of a solar farm, that means the solar power generates power during the day. The battery soaks some of that up and then releases into the grid in the evening after the sun has gone down. But I'm not going to talk about that case. I am going to talk about the use case like you see in the picture, where it is located on its own, just next to a transmission line. But I've pictured it up here next to a much, much smaller residential scale battery, plus the power wall, or commercial scale batteries, these that you would use to back up a home or a building during a power outage. So the commercial scale one you might use in your town to have a cooling center during extreme hot weather if the power goes out, for instance, or an emergency response system. The reason I've shown the three together is it's really important to understand that these are all the same thing. They are made up of the very same small lithium-ion battery cells, just assembled together in smaller or bigger packages. And they are, for that matter, more or less the same cells that we all carry around in our cell phones and in our laptops and in our myriad other devices. They are just bigger assemblages of them. So the question I'm asking or trying to answer is, why are we all of a sudden, fine batteries have been around for a while, right? But why are we all of a sudden talking about putting so many of them together in these big packages, big enough that they can provide backup services, not just that, but they can support the entire electrical grid, like you see on the right? Well, start with cost. For the last 3+ decades, the price of these batteries has been plummeting. And it is expected to continue plummeting at the same rate for the next couple of decades. And the reason I'm saying this, it's really important to understand not just that the price is falling, but why. Right? The reason is that battery cells, the fundamental units that these things are made of, are like computer chips. We manufacture them in factories over and over and over and over again by the millions and billions. And as with computer chips, the more we make of them, the better we get at making them. Right? So in the case of computer chips, that means that every couple of years you can fit twice as many transistors on a chip. And so a chip will have more computing power, but use less energy and less space and be cheaper. In the case of battery cells, the underlying technology of the cell itself is improving every single year. And so you can store more energy, for instance. Right? But also the systems engineering that is wrapped around it, and really importantly, and again, as with computer chips, the manufacturing processes get more precise and better every single year. And so what that means is that it's not just a story about the price getting lower every year. That is sort of a byproduct of the more fundamental story of these things are getting better. The underlying technology is getting better, and importantly, safer every single year. And in a way, you kind of already know this, because I mentioned these are the same cells that are in our cell phones and laptops and Roombas and whatever else, right? And you probably remember 15 years ago, you would read a news story occasionally about someone's cell phone catching fire, right? You don't read those stories anymore. Even though now more than half the population of planet Earth, billions of people, are carrying these things around in their pockets, right? And the reason is because we have gotten so much better at making these things. So I'll come back to fire safety at the end. I know people have questions about that, as you should. But what it's meant is that as they have gotten cheaper and cheaper, less expensive every year, it has become economical to deploy them on bigger and bigger scales. So no longer just in a $600 item of consumer electronics, but big enough scale to support the entire electrical grid. And that's what we're seeing. So this is the US. You can see that deployment of these things is taking off exponentially. The same thing is true almost every country in the world. It is a global thing. There is a real revolution happening under our noses in the way electrical grids operate. And you can see in the US, states like Texas, California, and Florida are ahead of the curve. New York, we're just getting started. As the saying goes, the future is here. It is just not evenly distributed. Right? So why then? So I've said, okay, these things are getting cheap, so we can now afford to deploy them on the grid. But why do we want to? Why do grid operators want to deploy these things so badly? Two basic reasons. The first is economics. And that's mostly what I'm going to talk about today. They make the grid operate much more efficiently and therefore at lower cost. And the second is resilience and reliability. They help keep the lights on. So there are actually lots of ways that batteries work for the economics of the grid. I'm only going to talk about two of them. The first is by providing access to cheaper power. Explain what I mean by that. So this is something that batteries do everywhere that they're deployed, but it's especially true in our part of New York State because of the energy geography of New York State. So the thing you need to understand is that New York has functionally not one, but two almost separate electrical grids. The grid in upstate and western New York, is this yeah, grid in upstate and western New York, light blue here, is supplied overwhelmingly with very clean and also very cheap, inexpensive forms of electricity generation. So think hydropower from Niagara Falls, also from Quebec. Think a growing amount of wind power. Think a good amount of nuclear power, and a small but very rapidly growing, and expected to grow a lot in the next few years, amount of solar power. But this thing here, these yellow hash marks, actually, before I get to that, so you see the downstate, the generation mix looks very different, right? These black lines represent high voltage transmission lines. Those are what you see on the big 150-foot tall metal lattice towers. They are for shuttling bulk power around the state. You can think of them as the interstate highway system for electricity, right? But these yellow hash marked area, this is an area called the Central East Constraint, where we just don't have enough of those high voltage transmission lines. It is more like a two-lane highway. And so at times during the day, most of the day actually, when demand for electricity in our part of the state is high, we cannot bring that cheap power from upstate over these lines because, as we say, they are congested. They are full. They are carrying as much as they can carry. So what do? We fire up fossil fuel powered peaker plants. This is the dance camera plant near Newburgh, one example, and to supply electricity in the Hudson Valley. And two things to know about these. One is they pollute our local air, and the Hudson Valley is shaped like a bowl. So although we are green and lush and beautiful, we actually have some of the higher asthma rates in the country. And these power plants are a significant contributor to that. But the second thing to know, and more important for my purposes today, is these things are just much more expensive to operate than the four sources of power that are available upstate, but that we can't get here, right? And so you can see this. This is a snapshot I took a while ago from the New York ISO, Independent System Operators, real-time dashboards. The New York ISO runs the market, wholesale electricity market, where our utilities buy power, which they then pass on to us. And it's divided into zones. We are in zone G. And you can see that we, at the time that I happened to take the snapshot, we were paying almost $27 for a megawatt hour of electricity. And if you look upstate, you'll see $12, $14, $14. We're paying twice as much because that cheap power that I talked about is available there, but we can't get it to us. And so we are paying to fire up those power plants in the Hudson Valley that are more expensive to operate. Right? So how do batteries help with this? Well, overnight, demand for electricity is much lower, right? People are sleeping, most businesses and factories are closed. And so those high voltage transition lines, including the Central East constraint, that are clogged, congested during the day, they have lots of spare capacity overnight. And so what do? If we place batteries, again, along those high voltage transmission lines, through the Hudson Valley, into the city, into Long Island, we can charge them up overnight when those high voltage lines have lots of spare capacity. And then, during the day, when demand for electricity rises, instead of firing up those power plants in the Hudson Valley, we discharge those batteries into our local distribution grids. So we get cleaner air and cheaper power. That's something that batteries can do and do every day of the year. But where it really shines is in times of extreme weather. So you probably maybe remember June 24th of last summer, temperatures hit 100 degrees almost everywhere in the state. Everyone turned on their air conditioners at once, right? And so snapshots again from the real-time dashboard. So in zone G, by 10:30 in the morning, the price of electricity was $120 a megawatt hour. 3:40 in the afternoon, $1,255 per megawatt hour. And at 6 p.m., according to the New York ISO, the independent system operator that runs the grid, we were on the verge of dangerous widespread blackouts. They didn't happen, but we were sort of on a knife's edge. They were paying facilities like hospitals to turn on their backup generators, their diesel generators, to feed power back into the grid so that we had enough power. The price of power in our part of the state, there we go, was $2,500 per megawatt hour. Down in Long Island, $7,000 per megawatt hour. This shows up on the supply portion of our electric. When you get your bill, you don't see the price at this time of day, on this day, and this time of, you just see an average. It's sort of spread all over the whole month period. But what this means is this is a single day in which the cost to customers, to us, is the equivalent to weeks or months of electricity usage other times, right? Real hardship for many families, right? 20% of families in the Hudson Valley are behind on their electric bills. A day like this, you can feel what it does, right? So Texas, their electricity market functions differently. It's structured differently than the one in New York. And so in New York, we try not to have price spikes, like I was talking about a minute ago, right? The market is structured so that there are reserves that are available to try to avoid that. Texas market is structured differently. They allow those price spikes readily as a market signal. They save money in other ways, so it evens out and they have low cost power on average. But you can see in August of 2023, yeah, a lot of those price spikes. $5,000, $4,000, $2,000, a lot over one, right? But that's in the August heat when, again, everyone has their air conditioners on. But then you see a year later, August 2024, one big price spike around 3,000 and a couple of smaller ones. And then a year after that, basically nothing. How did they do that? They did it by deploying boatloads of batteries on their grid very, very quickly. That 2.7x, that's over an 18-month period, right? And so what happens is there are hundreds and hundreds of different batteries operated by different independent operators, right? And so they all charge up when power is very cheap. And then whenever the price of power begins to spike, right? They're all in competition against one another and against the generators. And so they are bidding into the market and they bid into the market at, a price that's a little above what it was when they bought, but not $4,000 or whatever. And they cut off that competition, and bidding cuts off those price spikes before they happen. Right? So that is one way that batteries reduce our prices, right? It corresponds to the supply charges section of our electric bill. But you may know that, in fact, the bigger portion of our electricity bill these days is not supply charges. It is what is called delivery charges. That is the cost of installing and then maintaining the poles and wires, transformers and substations, all the infrastructure that's necessary to bring the electricity that we buy to our doors, right? And so this is actually the bigger way, bigger than what I've been talking about, in which batteries save money. So electricity is different from any other commodity that I know of. Every other commodity, even water, you can store, right? Electricity, until now, basically you couldn't, not much. And so what that means is that every single moment of the day, demand for electricity and supply of electricity have to precisely equal each other. If they do not, if supply is below or actually even above demand, you have blackouts, right? And they're dangerous, and they can cascade across the grid and be hard to restart. And so what that means is that we have to build the grid, all the things I was talking about a moment ago, to meet the hour of the year, or actually of the coming decade, when demand for electricity will be at its very, very peak, right? So think 5:57 p.m. on June 24th, but then think, actually, no, we need to plan ahead, or maybe 5 years from now, there's going to be 105-degree day, right? So we need everything you see on this grid, right? So we need enough generation to generate enough megawatts of electricity for that 105-degree hour, right? 6 p.m. on that day that hasn't come yet. And the high voltage transmission line to carry all that electricity from the generators. And then the low voltage distribution lines that brings it from the substation to our homes and businesses. All of that has to be sized for that very peak hour. And what that means is, most of the time, all of this stuff is vastly underutilized. It's just sitting there running at a fraction of its capacity, right? But we have to pay to build it to meet that 1 hour that will come, lest we have dangerous blackouts at the time when we really need power, right? So we size the grid, we size everything to meet that peak demand. Here's the thing. Demand for electricity in New York and all over the US for the last 20 years is more or less flat. Grew a lot before then, and it's just been flat. Now it is growing rapidly, right? This is, again, from the New York ISO, and this was actually taken, this was from a report they released a couple of years ago, so before data centers and hyperscalers became as big a thing as they are now. So this is just looking at growth in not just demand, but peak hour demand from electric vehicle charging, from home heating as we switch from gas to electric heat pumps, right? So right now our peak demand is in the summer, those hot days, but our peak will switch sometime around 2030, 2035 to a winter peak. And it is expected to roughly double, somewhere between 2 and 2.5 times what it is now by 2040 and then 2050, right? And again, this is without data centers. So what does that mean? Well, if we do sort of the business as usual, the way we've always done things, what that means is that we would have to double everything you see on this diagram, right? Twice as much generating capacity, twice as much high voltage transformers, twice as high capacity substations and distribution lines. That will be enormously expensive, right? Enormously. And we are already starting to feel it in our electric bills, right? You guys We all know this, right? And studies are very clear that the predominant driver of our electric bills, price of power from gas is going up, but the predominant driver of our electric bills is rising transmission and distribution costs. As we're doing two things at once. We have to build new grid infrastructure, and also it just so happens that a lot of the grid infrastructure, we are at the end of life cycle of a lot of the grid infrastructure that already existed. So there's stuff that needs to be replaced, and that's expensive enough. And then we need to, maybe business as usual, double the capacity of everything that's there. So what we're staring down the barrel of is increases for, like we've been seeing, for decades to come. Not a comfortable prospect, right? How do batteries help? Well, so picture the scenario like we talked about before in the Hudson Valley, where we put batteries, right, along the high voltage transmission lines, right? I've shown here a couple other places as well. I said before, most of the time, our existing capacity is grossly underutilized. Average capacity use on the grid, this is not specific to New York, this is US-wide. I don't know the New York, I don't think I even know the New York figure exactly, but for the grid as a whole, it is less than 50%, right? Because we have to size it to meet those peaks. So most of the time, the grid is just sitting there underutilized. So we put these batteries, and we do, like we were talking about before, we charge them up at the hours of the day when the grid is underutilized, right? And then along comes 6 p.m. on a 100 or 105-degree day, and we discharge those batteries, right? We are using the existing, so at that time, we use the existing power generation, the existing transmission, right? And then over that last mile, we are also discharging these batteries, which have stored up power from when this stuff was underutilized, right? And so instead of upgrading all of this upstream stuff or upgrading it nearly so much, we still have to upgrade this last mile. We have to upgrade the distribution wires to carry that much power to our homes and businesses. There's a role that batteries can play here too, and I'm not going to talk about that. But we don't need to upgrade all of this upstream stuff, or at least much, much less. So this is another way that batteries help save money, and to boot, they help avoid power outages. That's exactly what happened in Texas. This is according to their grid operator, ERCOT, in 2020. Let's see, get the dates right. 2024, they put their chance of a power outage from insufficient supply at 12%. By 2025, because of those batteries they deployed, reduced to 1%. It's according to their independent grid operator. So this is not, I'm not presenting you my brilliant idea or something. This is something that has been studied by academics, by energy modelers, all over the place. So a 2024 study said if we can deploy 6,000 megawatts of batteries in New York by 2030, it will save New York customers $2 billion in aggregate. It's not a small amount of money. But here's the thing. Whether that happens is not up to the New York Independent System Operator. It's not up to the state, to NYSERDA, or even the governor or the legislature, right? In order for these batteries to play the roles that I'm talking about, it doesn't work, or it doesn't work nearly as well, to just like put a few batteries all in one place out in a cornfield in the middle of nowhere. They need to live where we live. They need to be widely distributed. And so that means that local decision makers, town boards, city councils, zoning boards, right? It will be the decisions made town by town, municipality by municipality, which either enables this decision or blocks it, this strategy. So it's up to you guys and the people that you guys interact with every day. So one of the things that it's up to you to think about is, well, but what about the other side of the table? What about fire safety? People are scared of these things, right? I've heard about fire safety. And by the way, I should say, I don't usually talk about fire safety because when I first worked on my own town, Poughkeepsie, I brought in a fire safety consultant by the name of Paul Rogers, who was a 30-year veteran of the FDNY. And he developed the city of New York's, the FDNY's fire code for batteries. He was the lead person from the FDNY in developing those. And then in 2023, you probably all remember, there were 3 battery fires in New York State. And so the governor convened an interagency fire safety working group, and they brought in experts from all over the country. But one of the lead people on it was, again, this guy, Paul Rogers from the FDNY. And so I brought him to speak at the town of Poughkeepsie. He is now, he's left the FDNY and he has his own fire safety consultancy. So anyway, since that time, I've been giving talks alongside him in front of various town boards, which I'm happy to do, by the way, if any of you, if you want your town to hear what I'm saying, I'm happy to do this. And I'm a volunteer. I'm not being paid for this by anyone. I'm just doing it because I think it's important. So the way that electric utilities make money, right, by law, is through capital investments. They deploy capital, they spend money to build poles, wires, substations, et cetera. And then they get a guaranteed rate of return, 9.5%. They're regulated, it has to be approved by the Public Service Commission for the state, but on all of that. Batteries mean they have to build a whole lot less of that stuff. This is not a conspiracy, this is not their evil, this is just their incentives. Their incentives are not to build batteries because that is a way to spend less money upgrading the grid. It allows us to use more of the grid they've already earned their profit on. So again, not a conspiracy, not their evil, but just they have no incentive. But second part of your question, or second thing, it's not the way it's structured. And again, this is from the regulations from the Public Service Commission. For the most part, this could change, but for the most part, batteries count as if they were power generation. They count like power plants, right? They're not generating power. They're soaking up power and then releasing it. But utilities don't own the power plants in here, right? In some states, there are vertically integrated utilities. We restructured our utilities 90s. And so there are independent power producers that own all the power plants, whether they're gas, whether they are hydropower, whether they are nuclear, whether they are solar or wind. So batteries are coming in just like another independent power producer. And so the utility couldn't build a power plant if it wanted to. And as of right now, according to current law, they couldn't really build a battery if they wanted to. So an independent power producer comes in, they build the battery, they make money, and that means that the utility does not get to upgrade its wires, its poles, as much as it would have. So they are required by the Public Service Commission to allow this and to accommodate, right, batteries that come in. However, I can tell you, so I told you in the town of Poughkeepsie where I live, there was a proposal from a battery developer, and we passed a law and we enabled it, and it didn't get built because they couldn't come to good terms of interconnection with our utility, Central Hudson. And I will tell you, the developer says the utility was not being reasonable. They were following the letter of the law, but they were not being reasonable in making it very, very expensive for them to build that battery there. I think you're right. So utilities would like to be able to build their own batteries. Right now, they can't. They may change. That's why I said there are conversations in the Public Service Commission, also in the legislature, about changing that, and I would not be surprised if it changes. But they also, even if they're building it, they have, I mean, so like if someone's going to build a battery, you're right, they would rather it would be them, right? But it is also the case that building a battery means it's way cheaper to put a battery on the end of a transmission line than to build a whole new transmission line, right? And so they will not build as many batteries. They will build as many batteries as they have to. As the Public Service Commission says, no, it's not reasonable to build more transmission lines when there could be a battery here instead. They will not build more than they have to. So there are batteries and they're more so going forward, will be batteries at every scale and every level. But what I'm talking about, the use case that I've been talking about mostly is where they are located along the transmission line, high voltage transmission line, at a substation where power gets stepped down to the local, so it's right at the node of interconnection between those two. So the batteries I've been talking about are pretty big. They could be 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, right? But for instance, there is in New York City, there is a developer called 9.Energy, which is putting these little 5 megawatt, they're called community batteries, in at the distribution level, not on the high voltage transmission lines. Con Ed just stopped them for just the reason that we were talking about. Is like they came up with all kinds of technical reasons why this wasn't good for the grid, but it was eating Con Ed's lunch. So no, there can be batteries at all different scales, but the case that I'm talking about is big enough that it is operating on the transmission grid. It's but it's where the transmission grid steps down to the distribution grid. So first of all, this is something that you all should know as local officials. So you can or towns can and absolutely should impose in their permitting laws a bonding requirement so that the developer is responsible for and pays in advance to dispose of these, decommission these at the end of life, right? So if a developer goes bankrupt, you don't want to be on the hook, right? But second of all, these things, unlike plastic bottle, you throw it in the recycling bin, odds are it does not get recycled, right? These things, the minerals in them are extremely valuable. And so they have a recycling rate of above 95%. There are new recycling facilities, big ones, being built all around the country as the first wave of EV batteries come off. But right now they're still doing cell phone batteries and stuff. But these things are highly recyclable. So it's not the case that if a developer's there, they don't want to just throw it in the trash because it is valuable. These are valuable metals. And there's a whole ecosystem for that developing in the economic. You don't need, regulation is good. You should have regulation for it, but you also kind of don't need it because the economic incentives are already there. So divided into two parts. Supply of electricity, right? Like just how much generation is there? That we have all these independent power producers. They're not owned by the utility. They invest their own money and they say, I'm going to build a power plant or a solar farm or a battery or whatever, right? They are bidding against each other in a market every single day. There's a day ahead market. So the system operator says, at 3 o'clock tomorrow, we think we're going to need however many megawatts in the Hudson Valley. And they are bidding and saying, well, I can do it for this much a megawatt hour. I can do it for that much a megawatt hour. And so this is just a market process where the lowest cost wins. So if there are batteries in there that are able to underbid those fossil fuel generators or anyone else, right? The market gives us the lowest cost supply of electricity. But I think maybe you were asking more about the utilities and the poles and the wires. So when the utility wants to build poles and wires, anything, when they want to invest capital and therefore get that guaranteed rate of return, they have to make a rate case before the Public Service Commission, right? And what that does is they say, look, here are our studies that show, here's why we need more wires here, here, and here. And here's how much more capacity we need, and here's what. And the Public Service Commission has under it the state's DPW, Department of Public Works, and they study that stuff. And they can prove it, they can deny it, they can do something in the middle where you say, like, go back and study this. Go back and study, this option you haven't considered. And so the only safety we have is the Public Service Commission doing its job. So what I'm describing here is a way in which it is possible and studied and understood by the Public Service Commission that for the grid to operate with less investment, with less capital upfront, et cetera. Whether, and utilities, they want to invest more and therefore make more profit, right? What happens? Well, that's a dance between the utilities and the Public Service Commission, and how much trust should you have in the Public Service Commission? I'm, not promising that they're going to perfectly do their job and give us every ounce of savings. But it is the case that this puts a lower cost option on the table. It makes it harder for a utility to say, we really need to double our transmission capacity, when in fact now we're meeting peak demands with these batteries. So can they still get rate increases? I'm sure they can and will, right? But harder, not as much. At least that's, you got to put it this way. If you don't do this, then you have to have rate increases because they have no choice but to build the stuff. Here's a lower cost way of doing things, right? And, and then the regulatory apparatus has to do its job in order for that to translate into them not overbuilding. It's not a thing where, one town has done it and therefore they get lower rates. Doesn't work that way, right? It's not the whole state. I showed you there are those zones. We are zone G, right? If there is enough battery capacity in zone G to cumulatively, this town and this town and this town, right, to outbid, say, the Danskamer-Thieker plant or Roaston or whatever, then we will feel it in our rates. But one town isn't going to do it by themselves. Let me talk about the general fire safety issue, which means something. And this, by the way, this is my first time giving a public talk on fire safety because, as I said, I usually I've been giving talks, and I've been giving them with this guy Paul Rogers, who's the FDNY guy who helped write the fire code first for New York City and now for New York State. And so I will tell you, I don't have firsthand expertise in this stuff. Most of what I'm telling you is from stuff I read, but also from. So if you look up battery fires, if you Google battery fires, what you will probably find is a fire at this place. This is Moss Landing in California. It's a very bad fire. And what you'll see is this was a power plant, power plant. And the horizontal long building here, this is where the battery is. This is a gas turbine hall from the power plant. They took out the gas turbine and they repurposed it and stuffed it full of batteries. And this is unique in the world. There is no other battery facility that anyone knows of like this. And the event that happened as a result, we'll see pictures of on the internet, was also unique in the world. So here's what it looks like inside. Those are battery things. So what do you see? Tell me what you see just looking at that. They're shipping containers, yeah, or they're they've got cabinet work. But what else do you notice? Yeah, there's paper and stuff. First of all, they're indoors. Sorry, you say?
Stacked on top of each other.
They're stacked vertically, and they're really close to each other horizontally. Right? So they're indoors, which means, first of all, if something catches on fire, the heat and the gas are trapped in that big structure. And then they're packed together horizontally and vertically, right? And I will tell you, these batteries are what are called NMC, nickel manganese cobalt batteries. They're the same batteries that are in our phones. These are NMC batteries. But now, today, every battery that is used for stationary battery storage is what is called lithium iron phosphate, or LFP, which does not have nickel, manganese, or cobalt. It's less energy dense, and it burns less readily and at a lower temperature. Still burn. But these are NMC batteries, the ones in our phones, which are more energy dense, and therefore they burn more readily and at a higher temperature. Okay. The important thing to know is this facility could not be built today, almost anywhere, certainly not in New York, because it violates existing fire codes in about 150. I'm exaggerating, in a dozen different ways, right? Both the kinds of batteries, how they're packed together, the fact that they are in this closed structure that does not allow any heat or gas to escape. So New York has a brand new fire code as of January 1st, 2026. And I mentioned there were 3 battery fires in New York in 2023. And as a result of that, the governor convened this interagency fire safety working group. They brought in experts from all over the country, right? Paul Rogers, the guy I know, was one of the leads. He had developed the code for FDN. And so they made all these recommendations, which I'm happy to talk through afterwards, but it would take a long time. So I'm not going to talk through now. And I strongly recommend that if like your town is pursuing this, that you talk to a real fire safety expert who's not me, who will talk through these. I mean, I know what these are, but you talk through these away. But of all these codes, so the one thing I want to emphasize with these codes is that they are sort of stacked. At the back, there's the International Fire Code that's incorporated. There's the NFPA Code 855 that is incorporated, and then the New York Fire Code like includes all of those, and then and one of the things that is in the elections, all of these, is these UL, Underwriters Laboratory Certifications, right? So UL, you guys all know this, right? The independent third-party laboratory that runs tests for the insurance industry. Like something has to get UL certification in order to be insurable. So there are lots and lots of UL tests at sort of every component, from the level of cells, to the modules that cells are assembled into, to the racks, to the whole containers, right? I'm not going to talk about most of them. Yeah, I can answer questions later if you want, but I want to draw your attention to this one, UL 9540A, because New York City was the first place to require this. New York State has now required it as well, and I believe I'm not sure of this, but I believe we might be the only state that requires it. It's certainly not required everywhere, right? And here's what this says. If you want to install a stationary battery in New York State, you have to test it, not just the cells, just the modules, and just the racks. You have to take one of these whole big containers. They cost more than $1 million a piece. Here's what you have to do. You turn off all the HVAC equipment that's built into it, all the fire suppression, all the ventilation, all the battery management that's supposed to control the heat and the voltage of the batteries. Turn all of that off and then light it on fire. And watch and measure how it burns. And when the FDNY did this, battery manufacturers, their battery developers said, no, right, this costs $1 million. We are not going to do this. And they said, fine, take this, and then they agreed to do it. And so now this is required for any kind of battery that goes into New York State. So they actually light it on fire, and they measure how the fire propagates from cell to cell, from module to module within the container, and then they measure the heat flux coming off of the container. So how much you measure 6 inches away, and a foot away, and 2 feet away, and say, okay, what's the temperature? When this is burning, it's hot as it can burn, with all the fire safety stuff turned off in it, all that equipment turned off. How much heat is it throwing out? Right? And so then here is what contrast this with Moss Diamond. Here is what a modern battery in New York looks like. Right? You notice that they are outdoors. Right? There's no container, there's no building trapping heat and gas. Right? They are spaced according to that test that I just told you about, the 9540A. So they are spaced so that if these things, you put one of these fully on fire, make it burn as hot as it can, so that the fire will not propagate to the next container. And what that means is you will hear that there are locations in Ulster County and Dutchess County where facilities are being proposed with hundreds and hundreds of these containers, very big ones. And people come in and say, my gosh, if this catches fire, this would be a huge fire. And that's not the case. The thing to know is if these catch fire, you are talking about at most one container catching fire, right? They are spaced and tested so that they do not spread. And the third thing to know is these batteries are not mentioned before NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt. These are lithium iron phosphate batteries. So they do not have those dangerous metals. They burn. This is the fire. Who's from Warwick? Okay, you guys recognize that, right? This is after it settled down a little bit. There was more. Here is the thing that a fire safety expert will tell people, and people do not want to hear this. This is what's called a successful failure, right? You do not want it to fail. You do not want a fire. But notice that the fire did not propagate to the next container. It didn't even propagate across the whole container. It failed in the way that it was designed to fail, right? There is no piece of equipment in the world that someone can say this could never, under any circumstance in the world, 1 in a million, fail. You can't do it, right? But what fire safety engineers and designers do is design things so that if they fail in a way that does not impose danger, that does not impose risk. And that is what you saw in Quora, right? The fire, it's worth saying, this is not official, but you guys can validate for me that this is known. The fire wasn't caused by the batteries themselves. That was an electrical fire caused by water infiltration. These were bad containers. The company that did this is now out of business, right? Rightly so. So water infiltration, so there was an electrical fire, not part of the batteries. Spread like batteries of fire, but it wasn't batteries that caused. Okay. You do not have a choice about using the fire code. You don't have to consult it. It is automatically, it cannot be built in New York State except to the state fire code. And zoning is not about fire safety. Zoning is about land use. Fire safety is determined by the fire code. It's different from the zoning code. And one of the things that, and this is important, one of the things that is in the state fire code, which again, most advanced in the country, is there is third-party peer review. What that means is like your town board or your zoning department, you do not have, I'm guessing, a battery engineer on staff who is able to review this thing and know what's going to be safe and what's not. So according to the fire code, you can pick, the developer pays for, but you choose a third-party expert to come in and peer review the whole plan, the whole design, the whole engineering and everything.
And at the expense of the applicant.
At the expense of the applicant, but the applicant doesn't choose who you have to review it. You choose that.
Right.
And that is built into the state fire. So let me, I don't know how we are on time. Let me keep moving.
Yeah, we should try to wrap it up in a couple minutes.
Okay, let me do real quick. Toxins, right? Everyone is fit, but these battery fires are different from other fires because they are toxic, right? Here are the 3 toxins that are of greatest concern: carbon monoxide, hydrogen fluoride, hydrogen cyanide from battery fires, right? You do not want to stick your face into that smoke and breathe any of that stuff. You do not, right? Here's the thing to know. These are the same, this is the same profile as a structure fire, right? The PVC pipes in your house, when they burn, they produce hydrogen fluoride, hydrogen cyanide. Okay. Lithium iron phosphate batteries, again, don't have the nickel, manganese, cobalt. Those are not there. These are not more toxic than a structural fire. And the difference between them and a structural fire is there's a fence around them, right? They're within a confined space. No one has to be evacuated from it. No one has to go there. During every fire incident in the state of New York and almost every fire incident in the nation, right? There's live air monitoring at the site perimeter. So gentlemen from Warwick can confirm this. The fire burned for a few hours, but there was someone there for about 3 days monitoring the smoke. It's actually Paul Rogers, the guy I mentioned. He physically went there and he told the fire folks, you go home, right? But they were there with the smoke. And the only reason they had to be someone actually physically there was because the smoke monitor that they had, the air monitor, wasn't something that you could just like sit on. They had a place to put it. They had to, like, someone had to be there actually operating the smoke monitor. Don't ask me why. So they were there for 3 days monitoring it. And this has been the case, though, at every fire in New York and almost every fire in the nation. In no case, in any battery fire that there has been, have elevated levels of any of those toxins, hydrogen cyanide, have been found outside the fence line of the facility. People think we will have, if one of these catches fire, if that happens, we will have a catastrophe, we will have to evacuate our town, we will have to evacuate a neighborhood. People have done evacuations, it's not recommended, right? People, you should treat it like you treat a structure fire. You close your windows, right? Don't stand in front of the smoke, right? But in no cases have elevated toxin levels been found beyond the fence line. So immediately after every fire event, in New York, the DEC, across the world, across the country, the EPA tests oil, tests water. In the case of the Warwick fire, they swabbed the surface of the school that was nearby, right?
Yes.
And in no case, at Moss Landing, sorry, not quite in Moss Landing, independent research, so they found nickel, manganese, and cobalt trace levels in soil, right? With the exception of that globally unique fire, in no other case has toxic residue. There have been dozens and dozens of these fires, right, in different places. Has toxic residue been found in soil or water or when they swap surfaces beyond the fence line? Ever. Right? So, to this gentleman's question, you don't try and put it out, right? It's not like an EV fire that's on a road and you have to worry about, right? The best practice is just like it is with a propane fire, just like it is if an electrical substation catches fire, is in any of these cases, firefighters will not go into an electrical substation that's on fire. They will stand back, they will spray mist on any surrounding vegetation that they're worried about, and they will let it self-consume. Same with a propane fire. A substation fire is much more toxic than a battery fire, right? Those cans of transformers have distillate oil in them that burn. That stuff is toxic. You do not want to breathe that. They use much more hazmat equipment. But in all three cases, right, batteries, you just stand back, you let them self-consume, you monitor the air. So grid batteries are new to people's experience, right? But they are less dangerous than the substations that we have dotted around our towns, which really are toxic if they catch fire and which do catch fire. Not infrequent, it's not an uncommon thing. They are less toxic, less dangerous than all kinds of infrastructure that we accept and depend upon, but they are new. And so people are scared. And that is understandable. But it is the job of people with expertise to sort of provide evidence so that people can weigh those concerns against the kinds of benefits that I talked about.
All right, then, I'm going to start. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to the Orange County Municipal Planning Federation. My name is Lindsay Auden. I've been involved in the energy business for almost 45 years, and I have worked on various battery installations, and I'm going to tell you about a particular one. In the diagram you can see behind the text, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, this is a progress picture. The building system was not finished at the time I took this aerial photograph, but in the lower right-hand corner, you see a battery energy storage system at the Croton-Harmon train station. We are just a short distance from Peekskill, and we've finished our battery system some time ago. And the rest of these large flat surfaces you see are solar canopies. Now, I'm not going to try to sell you on this idea. I'm going to tell you how we did it, why we did it, how we got it done, and what the benefit can be to you beyond any of the general stuff that's been talked about as far as saving the world, doing the grid, cutting your electrical costs, I'm going to show you how, in essence, this whole thing can be looked upon as an opportunity, not a burden. Okay, so if you forget everything else I tell you, just remember what I'm going to tell you on this slide in the next 3 or 4 minutes. Through a local government, a community, this is Croton in this case, can secure financial benefits from a battery energy storage system. It's a tenant in your community, just like anything else. A tire warehouse, a garden center, whatever. It's another light industrial facility. Think in those terms and what you would do to control any of those others at the same time. So when you create regulations, understand that you want to do it with an understanding that this is an opportunity. Many of these light industrial facilities, BESS included, you can tax them, you can regulate them. They can produce local wealth for the community. Due to various recent changes in IRS tax rules, right now there is a battery gold rush going on, where developers are seeking sites for their batteries in our region and elsewhere. As mentioned by Dr. Seidman, in the downstate area, we have a lot of congestion on the transmission and distribution systems. So that is a problem, but also an opportunity. The opportunity is to participate in ways in which we can reduce that congestion and get paid to do it. So I'm going to suggest to you that you think going forward that rather than opposing these things as municipal officials, you may want to figure out ways to share in that opportunity by learning how to best leverage it to benefit your constituents. That's my trip. That's the main thing I'm going to say to you. And now I'm going to tell you about our system and how we benefited from our installation. This is an aerial view of the Croton-Harmon train station. The train station is circled in that red oval. The blue rectangles are the 12 solar canopies. Croton owns the parking lots on both sides of Veterans Plaza. That's the main drag going down the middle of the station. The commuters pay to park there. This is a significant source of revenue for Croton. Almost 10% of its full revenue comes from parking fees at the train station. So it's a bit of a gem for us, so to speak. The system, the canopies generate about 4.2 megawatts of power that charges the 3.5 megawatt, 15 megawatt hour BESS, just to give it that short term. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, that's where the BESS system is. It's just slightly off this photograph. I'll show you some more pictures in a minute. The power that is generated by the solar canopies goes into the battery system, and then from the battery system into the grid. It does not go to any specific use in Croton. Overall, the system produces about 5,000 megawatt hours a year and avoids about 2,000 metric tons of greenhouse gases, which is the equivalent of taking about 600 cars off the road. This is all on top of 10 acres of existing blacktop. Through a long-term lease, the vendor for this system, because he leases our space, we don't own the system, he pays us about $473,000 a year. Serious money. Now, let's give you a quick history of how this all happened. 1964, the land that we eventually got was previously owned by the New York Central Railroad, now Metro North, the same thing now, which previously used it as a trash and a dump landfill. It was a mess. Suffice to say, we bought it, we converted it into a paying parking lot, turned it into an asset that produced village revenue. Going forward, as canopies and solar canopies and carports developed, along with batteries that would work with them, various vendors came to us, developers, and said, "Oh, let me put something on your parking lot there. I'll pay you $10,000 a year." We said, "Get real. That's a single one of these canopies that we have now. If you build a small one, it's nothing. We could build something bigger." So the village said, "Nah, we're not interested in any of these things because they're not giving us any serious money." But then along came COVID. COVID had a situation for us wherein a lot fewer people were parking in the parking lot because they weren't going to work in the city. Croton is about 30 miles north of Manhattan, about roughly 45 minutes on the train and express, and a lot of people, thousands of people park at our parking lots. We have over 2,000 parking spaces. It's also an Amtrak stop on the Hudson line. So we have people going north and going south. So the parking was really a major issue. So the Croton Village Board saw that they were losing revenue, and they came to the various committees. My sustainability committee, I'm the chair of it, said, wait a minute now, suppose we put a much bigger canopy situation on this, much bigger than anybody suggested in the past, and we lease out the space. We're not leasing the system, we're leasing out the space. That'll be no cost for us, and we'll get paid rent by a developer. And they said, oh, you think you can do that? Why don't you go out and take a look? In the following months, in July and August, I put together a request for interest, an RFI, and sent it out to 168 developers, solar and BESS developers. 21 of them said, okay, I'm interested, send me the RFP, the request for proposals. We did so. That yielded 7 decent proposals. We then dickered around as to which one is the best, and finally, a number of months later, in March of 2021, we rented out our space under a lease. The work itself was delayed by COVID. A lot of people weren't working. They would, all kinds of problems. We finally got started in late 2022. It was substantially completed in 2025, and we got our permission to operate. That's a PTO. The permission to operate was secured earlier this year. All for the last year or so, year and a half, we've been testing this thing. Various things occurred. Somebody else bought the system, et cetera, et cetera. But we finally got it done. And we have been collecting that $473,000 a year, even during the time of construction. So let's take a closer look at what Croton put together, just the battery part. The battery has about 100 tons, the system has about 100 tons of lithium iron phosphate, hereinafter called LFP for short. They are housed in 4 60-foot long white steel cabinets. These things are, and some of this has already been said by Jeff, they're heavier, they're clunkier than the more efficient lithium ion nickel metal cobalt units, the ones that have been problematic. But the developers say they have a clean fire safety record, and we looked into this pretty carefully. Now, we did our development before there was the New York State Fire Code covering these issues. So we, to the developers, said, we haven't got any laws on this just yet, but you got to follow NFPA, National Fire Protective Association, code number 855 when you do your design. And that's what came out of here. Just as Jeff mentioned, all the large battery containers, the cabinets, are separated, in our case by about 8 or 9 feet each. There's nothing else nearby to burn. The area is, and again, this is still an in progress photograph. The area is surrounded by an opaque fence, which is surrounded by foliage, so you can't even get anywhere near it or see it unless you go up in the air or up onto a high level and look down into it. Each of the cabinets holds hundreds of batteries, each of which is enclosed in a plastic housing. That's how they make these things. They hold enough power to run, if we allocated it this way, 700 average homes for 24 hours. Now, I'm a proponent of lithium iron phosphate, done a lot of research, pretty good, but I'll be first one to admit that if you stuff a battery and overcharge it too much, it'll burn. Anything will burn, including the battery in your electric toothbrush or your cordless shaver or your laptop for that matter. If you overcharge them or damage them, they will burn. It may not be the battery part that burns, but it will be the housing that will burn, which is made of plastic. So we have to do everything we can to, as you guys discussed for an hour before this, control or limit the damage that could be done during any kind of a fire. Now, our BESS, as I mentioned, is charged by the 4.2 megawatts of solar panels atop the canopies. Then there were changes to the incentives. So now what you have mostly are what are called standalone systems. That is no solar. That's the norm. Now, this graphic is going to look very much like one that Jeff already showed you. I borrowed this one from the New York Battery Energy Storage Technology Consortium. There are really 4 different levels of batteries right now. Residential, that's fairly small. Those are those Tesla cabinets. Some of those cabinets are so small that they are smaller than a battery that you would have from an electric vehicle. I have an electric car, had it for 12 years. My battery is bigger than what the Tesla people put on your wall. That's the minimum. And sometimes they're rated by the number of kilowatt hours they store. And just so it's not confusion, kilowatt hours are how much you use, kilowatts are how fast you use them. Then there are the building scale systems. Some call them commercial. These are usually about 50 to 100 kilowatts, and they store several hundred kilowatt hours. The Croton system is a community scale, what we call retail. There's typically between 1 and 5 megawatts. Now, one way to typify the battery, whether it's small or large, is through an abbreviation, either BTM or FTM. Smaller battery systems are behind the meter, which means it's feeding a load or bunch of loads at a particular site. You charge the battery, and that battery power goes into the building or the home. That's BTM. The kinds of batteries that we're most concerned with here are FTM, front of the meter. The Croton system is a front of the meter, 3.5 megawatt system. This means that power is stored. It then feeds back into for us, the local distribution grid at about 13,000 volts. The BTMs generally are much lower voltage. In a home, it's probably 240 volts. In a building, it might be 480 volts. So at the community scale level, we're talking about 13,000 volts into the distribution grid. The big ones, the power plant scale, also FTM, they will be putting out hundreds of thousands of volts. And they go, of course, into the transmission grid. So that's just to differentiate what these things are. Now, as far as standards and codes, you've already heard a bunch about this. I'm going to bother you with some more just to give you more background. Depending upon the size, that's the megawatts or megawatt hours, and the agency that's involved, you have a variety of different fingers in the pie, if you will. If it's a standalone system, less than 80 megawatts, that's allowed at local levels, which means you have to do the seeker, which that's an environmental quality analysis, and you may have local requirements, or as in Croton, there's an already existing BESS law that has to be followed. But you don't have to have separate licensing from the PSC. But once you go above 80 megawatts, and that's what I understand you guys are most concerned about, is these large systems, they have to be licensed by the New York PSC under Public Service Law Section 68. Bottom line is the vendor developer, the BESS developer, has to jump through a bunch more hoops. You also still have the requirement for a local seeker finding that this is an environmental quality regulation that says municipalities have looked at it and have said, okay, this qualifies and does not cause any environmental damage. We have looked at it and done a survey or study of it. There may be also other local review and approval processes involved. We're going to discuss some of them as we go along. Now, as Jeff pointed out, now, fortunately, you have the New York State Fire Code that came into effect this year. They adopted the NFPA 855, which is how the Croton system was designed. And they have all kinds of rules and regulations that cover how to design the system, how to install it. I will tell you that NFPA is a live document. It continues to be tweaked. I have a subscription to it, and about every 6 months or so, it says, oh, we're going to add a new rule. If you ever do have a BESS law that refers to NFPA 855, you always want to say latest edition of it, because as I mentioned, it continues to be tweaked in small ways, and that's a way that the control of these systems can be more lively, so to speak, to respond to anything else that's learned in time. And the battery energy storage systems have been around for a decade, but as we've seen, there's been some problems, just like with other large energy systems. When hydraulic fracturing was first developed, fracking as they call it, it was a mess. Now it is a standard. So these things oftentimes get rushed ahead by profiteers who want to make money, and they make a bad name for everybody else, and then the rules come along that fix it. That's where we are right now. Now, most of all, if not all of the product specifications, as versus design and installation, they're now standardized in the BESS industry, and they are in the New York State Fire Code. They in turn adhere to a variety of rules and codes that were developed even before NFPA and the State Fire Code. So I'll just list a few of them. I will not bother you with the details. Jeff already mentioned UL 9540A, which is full-scale testing. There's also tests down at the battery cell level. There's even tests that go all down to the auxiliary equipment that feeds power into and out of the battery. That includes inverters, which take the DC power from a battery, convert it to AC, so it can be sent into the grid at alternating current. And that particular UL code, 1741 SB, also has rules about maintaining a clean voltage and frequency, and also providing something called ancillary services. I'll talk more about that later, but that's a source of money. And finally, there is the IEEE 1547, which has rules for how you can connect to the grid so that you're not going to do anything bad to cause a blackout or a power outage. Now, that's a lot of stuff to think about and a lot of stuff to be involved in. So I'm going to tell you how you can simplify this and make some money for your community. So first, I'm going to tell you and answer the question, why bother with all of this? Why host a BESS? Well, there's a good reason. And this may be an oversimplification, but it's how I try to explain things to people. Think of it, a BESS, as a big ATM or cash machine. It has no on-site employees. There's no traffic or offices. It doesn't need any water, sewers, or fuel. Unlike something like a tire warehouse, it's not something that has stuff that's sitting out in the open that can burn. It emits no odor and very little sound, but it does perform a function. That function is to dispense wealth, just like a cash machine, some of which you can access for municipal or community benefits. How does it do that? There's a variety of ways in which money flows in and out of that battery. The first and foremost is what we call arbitrage. Now, Jeff described this already. It's a way in which they will grab the value of the power that differentiates between on-peak and off-peak. Now, where we are in Croton, the on-peak time is between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. That's when the price of power goes up. A battery will store power before or after that time when prices are low, and then when the prices spike, pay it back into the wholesale grid, sometimes at multiples of what they bought it for. This is basically the concept of buy low, sell high, just like on the stock market. You'll find a lot of parallels to how the stock market works in the electric power markets. A BESS also gets all kinds of money from a variety of other sources, including grid and utility ancillary service programs and a variety of state and utility incentives. Anybody who does BESS development in New York State, when they put together their prospectus or whatever, they look at how much they can get per kilowatt hour to store power. In most parts of the state, that is $175 per stored kilowatt hour. So if you have stored 1,000 kilowatt hours, you get from the state, if you properly apply for it, $175,000 lump sum, boom, as soon as you finish the system. That's an incentive. Ancillary services, unlike arbitrage, are power products, and that's generally what we call these things as they need to be described. A power product is something that is a way in which you configure how you provide electricity or commit to doing so. So, for example, there are ancillary services that have something called spinning reserve. Spinning reserve is something wherein you say, I'm going to keep my generator or battery available so you can call me in just a couple of minutes or less and I'll turn on and you'll get the power right away. It's based on the idea of having a spinning generator. A lot of this is old utility lingo. So batteries offer spinning reserve that has value because if the load on the grid goes up all of a sudden, somebody has to respond at that New York ISO, call and say, can you turn on your battery? Can you turn on your generator? We need your spinning reserve now, and we'll pay you plenty for it if you actually supply it. Likewise, there's frequency regulation to make sure that the 60 cycle waveform stays nice and clean. That's also an ancillary service for which they get paid. There's also something called black start. During an outage, you have to have some power plants which can start up completely on their own. Many other power plants require some power input in order for them to get their generator started. Black start means I can provide you power even if the entire grid goes down. And I'm going to get paid even if the grid never goes down. These are continuous revenue streams. So, by the way, if you want to know where all this in-house is done, you can email me. I'll give you my email address at the end, and I will send you to a website which describes this for wholesale power developers in great detail. But suffice to say that every battery energy storage system is a machine that produces wealth by taking advantage of these various programs and opportunities. Now, what does this mean for your community? How do you turn that into something that can go into your pocket? You being the municipality. It could be in the form of direct funds. You can tax these systems. You can rent space for them. You can charge a building permit fee and possibly other fees as well. Here's a rough number to keep in mind. To build a battery system and install it costs at least $1 million per megawatt. $1 million per megawatt. So somebody's going to install a 100 megawatt system. They're going to have to come up with $100 million. They're going to want that money back. But likewise, that $100 million, well, you know, what's your building permit fee? Is it 1%, 1.5%? What's 1% of $100 million? A lot of money. In Croton, our just building permit fee ended up being $250,000. You know, these are things to think about as to what you can do to take advantage of this process. Suppose, for example, there's an easement where in order to get the power from the battery to the distribution or transmission line, they got to cross one of your streets. Oh, they're going to want an easement. Oh, you know, that easement's very nice, but you know, you want to stay crossing my street and you got to dig up the street and fix and all that. I want to get paid for that easement or the right of way. This is true for whether it's a private owner or public property or just some generic right of way from the county. Anybody that's going to be impacted by this has an opportunity to charge for any of these situations that otherwise would never have occurred. You can also say, Mr. Battery Developer, we have to do a local seeker analysis. That's going to cost $20,000. We got to call in a consultant. You want to do anything here? You're going to pay for that. Are there any other required legal analyses? Well, you know, if you want to put your battery in here, we have to hire an attorney to go and look at the contract and all that. That's going to be another $20,000. We're going to want that back so that we don't pay anything for your installation. We come out cost-free. Then there are many other opportunities. Are there in-kind contributions? Well, you know, if this thing has any fire situation to it that requires us to have better fire equipment, maybe it would be a good idea, Mr. Best Developer, if you decided to donate something, maybe a new fire truck. And keep in mind that they get back their expenses as to whatever it is in their own way through either accelerated depreciation or whatever. In our particular case, we were going to put up and are now working on an adjacent EV charging station. We're putting in 18 charge ports. Now, that's going to go in adjacent to where our overall system is, in this case, near the solar panels, the solar canopies, and just a stone's throw from where the battery is. So for that whole system, we said, gee, you know, we'd like to put in an EV charging station, and you, Mr. Developer, you're already digging up our parking lot. You're already creating all kinds of channels for your high voltage lines underneath. How about this? And our planning board said this. So you guys on planning boards, listen up, right? Our planning board on their own, and I didn't even ask this. I thought they were so smart. They said, well, you know, we're putting in this charging station. How about this? How about as part of your work, you put in a power conduit that we can then connect to our charging station when we finally get it done? We got an extra $25,000 for that. We find that we should have really asked for $35,000, but nevertheless, you learn. So we got an extra $25,000 on top of all these other things I'm talking about, just to put in the conduit for the charging station. Now, in some cases, there may be input to what gets done under what's called the federal 30% either direct pay or IRA. That's the tax thing that survived the One Big Beautiful Bill. The BESSes still get a 30% tax credit, which they can sell or whatever. In Croton, we had to do some changes to, or request some changes to our drainage when we put in those giant solar canopies. And so we put some money up that said, okay, we want to channel that water here, make it so that the snow doesn't fall there. We put up some money. The developer counted that money because we gave it to him and he did the work. He counted that money as part of his overall costs. And we went back to him later and said, we put in a certain amount here. You're counting that as though you used that money to do this job, and you're going to get the 30% of that. We want some of that 30% back. We got $150,000 on top of everything else I said back as a result of that. There may also be a need for certain ongoing municipal services, an annual fire inspection, which done by one of your volunteers. Somebody's got to pay for the time if necessary, or for whatever cataloging or paperwork has to be done. You may also want to think about what's called a megawatt operating license, which says, okay, you put in 100 megawatts today, but I'll just bet you that in the time of the lease that you've got, this 25-year lease, you're probably going to come up with better batteries or something else that you can use to create more output of power. So if you put in 100 megawatts today, and tomorrow you add another 20 megawatts, well, your operating lease only allows you to do 100. You want to put another 20? That's an extra 20% on the operating license. Thank you very much. And be sure to make that check payable to so-and-so. Think about donations. Almost all these developers like to be able to be seen as doing something for the community without us even asking. And they practically forced on us. They gave the school system $10,000 so that they could tell the children, we are building these solar panels, we are putting in this battery energy system here to help save the planet. And please tell the children about that. You can talk to them about donations and how that is done. $10,000, as it turns out, was chump change. We should have asked for more. Nevertheless, you'll learn. Or it could go to something else. A community center. For other options, I suggest you use your municipal imagination. All you guys, I'm sure, are very good at figuring out how to get more revenue in order to avoid increasing the tax load on people. In our particular case, the $473,000 payment we get every year allowed Croton to avoid having to increase property taxes in a way that would have broken the 2% tax cap limit. Remember, the state has a rule that says down there at the municipal level, you can't raise taxes by more than 2%, this is property taxes, without a special dispensation. We didn't have to do that because the money we made from our system, this is the photovoltaic system and the battery, allowed us to avoid having to ask for more taxes. That was not lost on the taxpayers when they realized, oh, that's what we're getting back here, not increasing our taxes. Huh, this is not a bad idea. Now we get to some of the more boring parts of this presentation. I'm going to suggest that whatever you do in your towns and municipalities, that you create some form of BESS ordinance. This is a law that governs how battery energy storage systems can be installed, whether they're in homes, garages, buildings, whatever. We passed our BESS law in, I guess it was about 2023, somewhere around there. And again, we didn't have the fire code to back us up, so we put in there, must follow NFPA, etc. There are now a couple of documents that are available that have good templates for battery ordinances, laws. The first one is the NYSERDA most recent, I think it came out about a year ago, New York Battery Energy Storage System Guidebook for local governments. It has in there a template you can use. I suggest you get a battery ordinance before you get further involved in doing this stuff, because once you have it on the books, it's basically the first hoop that a developer must jump through. Somebody comes to you and says, look, we want to put a battery here. We're going to give you some money. Say, look, here's our law. Tell us that you're going to follow this law. Know that we're going to enforce this law. And if you don't like it, take your battery someplace else. But it sets a baseline so that everybody is on record, both community, critics, best developers, fire department, and sets that baseline of what laws are going to be enforced in your community. And in it, you can cite the zoning law, building permits, fire safety, whatever environmental codes, what permits you're going to require, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in addition to these laws, if you are going to lease out space, and I'm talking both to private property owners and also to any public property owners, your leasing contract can provide additional exercising authority. To property owners, I say, never own or lease a BESS. Don't own the equipment, don't lease the equipment. You want the BESS to simply be a tenant on your property under a lease. That way you have all the other regulations and rules and powers that a landlord has over a tenant. Some of these will duplicate laws. Some of them can be in addition. For example, if you wish, an owner can specify that on his property, he's only going to allow lithium iron phosphate batteries. You can't say that in a zoning code because this is a condition between you and a private entity, the BESS developer, and you can come up with whatever rules you want that will allow the lease to be accepted on both sides. We went through all kinds of other stuff where we were either trying to impose or negotiate additional terms. We had lawyers involved in all that. They basically slowed down the process. It helped to have a battery law on the books eventually to set a baseline. But a lease where you control the system as a tenant gives you other authorities. You, of course, want to include all the necessary stuff. Decommissioning bond, that's required in the state fire code. It's also required under NFPA 855, et cetera. But you can put some other conditions on the situation. In our BESS law, we say, yes, you must have a decommissioning bond, but also you can only site one battery on your property. You cannot add any more. And that gives you the option to control things that you could not otherwise do under a zoning law because it's a deal between you and the developer. Same with noise limits and things. I do avoid, I suggest, however, burdening a BESS project any more than you would any other comparable facility. A warehouse, I mentioned tire warehouses, they burn up all the time. Those are much worse than a battery, but you work out a way to do it. You either site it a distance away, and the concern about where you're going to site it, near a school or something. Let me just tell you one thing. There's a very good chance that in order to access a transmission line, these systems are going to have to be sited a good distance away from other things because you don't have 130,000 or 300,000 volt lines everywhere, and you don't want to have to travel too far from the battery to the transmission line, or else you're going to have to go through a whole bunch of other people's property who may all say no, or give me an extra $1 million or whatever. So these things cannot be sited just anywhere. They've got to be near a distribution line or a transmission line. We in Croton looked at a variety of our properties and found a couple that are pretty good, close to distribution lines, etc. And we are now developing another battery, nowhere near the parking lot, for 5 megawatts, and are looking at bringing in another nice chunk of change from leasing that space. So we're going to talk about leases. Let's just go through these variations and possibilities. And these are basically tips and tricks learned from experience, or if you've been a landlord, I've been a landlord for 40 years, you learn from going through experience that is not always pleasant. I suggest you base the rent on the size of the system and specify it. So in case they try to expand it or improve the technology, then it comes out as a lease issue that says, oh, we only leased you, 100 megawatts of load, of output. You're going to put something else in? Got to go back and talk about the lease and changing the rent. So base it on the size, because they're going to try to find some ways to make these things more capable so they can make more money. Avoid linking to any kind of state, federal, or utility incentive. And way back when we first started this project in 2020, you didn't have the Inflation Reduction Act, didn't have a bunch of other rules and regulations. And so because we weren't sure, and the BESS developer was unsure what incentives he would get, $175 per kilowatt hour or whatever, he said, and we went along with this, okay, we will peg a portion of the rent to how much you, Mr. Developer, get back in incentives. The more incentives you get, the more rent we get. That was fine, but then the developer's contractor screwed up the paperwork on his NYSERDA incentive. Instead of putting in how big he could build the system, he for some reason thought, well, I'm not really going to make it that big. I'll tell NYSERDA I'm going to put in the smaller system, not by a lot, by about 10%. And so when it came time for him to go to NYSERDA and say, hey, pay me, I got the thing done, NYSERDA said, oh, no, you didn't say you were going to put in this. You said you were going to put in that. We didn't sequester the money for this bigger system. We can only give you money based upon your paperwork. And so we got into a big pissing contest, which eventually got settled. We ended up agreeing to a lower annual rent in exchange for a much bigger upfront payment. So I would suggest don't link any of your rent to any other issues that are going on at the state, federal, or utility levels. Make money that you can get, not depending upon what other clowns are doing with their particular activities. You, of course, want to start the rent when the lease is signed, not when the power gets produced. We started the lease and started getting our rent as soon as the lease was signed and got 10% of the rent all the years that COVID and a strike by employees, not ours, but the contractors, and all kinds of other things that slowed the process down. We still got paid rent during that time. You should also include a annual rent escalator. This may depend upon negotiations. Rule of thumb, at least 2%. Some will offer 2.5%. Note that electricity prices are going to go up. The price of capacity is going to go up. You want to be part of the action, so therefore you want an escalator because you know the other guy's going to be making more money anyway, and you want a piece of the action. In a lease, you can also further limit the visual impact. We have an opaque fence, we have a foliage border, they maintain and trim the trees, yada, yada, yada. All that's built into the lease. You can bar any unrelated use of the space or an easement or a right-of-way. You can say, fine, you got a battery here? Great. I don't want to see any offices on this space. I don't want to see a store set up to do anything. I don't want to see you storing anything or building anything or digging a well. I don't want to see any photovoltaic panels on the roof up there without it being something I get money on. There's not going to be any routine parking, right? This is a remotely controlled white box. As it turns out, when we're finishing our project, the developer was a little loose on trying to get rid of all the stuff he stored there. There were I-beams, there were boxes, there were pallets. We had to lean on him over and over again. I can't say that he was using our space to store stuff for other projects, but it kind of looked like it. So always make sure you can say in there in the lease, you can't use this to store product or whatever for anything else, and it's got to be off the lot by X, a certain date. We eventually got all of it off the lot, but it took a little doing to do so. If they're going to put security cameras, which they should, and this is again something you can require from the lease, way beyond zoning law, make the cameras police accessible. This means that it's available either on YouTube or some other channel where if somebody calls in and says, oh, I think I see smoke coming out of one of the batteries, the cops, without even having to go there, can click on and see right away from the live cameras what's going on in the space. Likewise, if there's an intruder or something else or any other problem, make it so that both fire and police can easily see into the site without having to go there and take any risk. And make sure those security lights are nice and bright. When we upgraded the lighting under our canopies to give better lighting for the people who are parking their cars, we tripled the level of light that's measured in foot candles. They love it. It's now much brighter in the area in the middle of the night and also in the late afternoon during the winter. People come off the train, they can walk right out to their cars, they can read the license plates, they know where they are, and there's quite a difference. Half of our parking lot, we didn't add more lighting to it because it was not part of this project. And every now and then we'll get somebody to say, oh, look, you made it nice and bright over there on that side of Veterans Parkway. Why don't you upgrade the lighting on this side too? We say, if we're going to do a project, fine. But right now we're meeting the codes. But the extra lighting, everybody loved. If there's going to be any kind of excavation, and believe me, somebody's going to want to dig a channel to get from the battery out to the transmission line or distribution line. They're going to want to cut across roads, make sure that the excavation is fully restored, not just somebody filling it in, but they make the road nice and clean so that you don't have to go back there later and fill the potholes that they left. These are things you can build into a lease to make sure they are done well. And of course, you want to have visible metal signage. This is also required under the fire code, so that anybody sees anything wrong, there'll be a big sign that says, here's who you call during the emergencies. Metal signage that won't burn up. Now, a lot of this stuff is boring stuff to do, but it's based on experience. And let me just say that we learned from this. I hope you learn from it and understand these kinds of new light industrial facilities are opportunities to raise revenue for your village or town or county. So having said that, let me just say thank you very much. My name is Lindsay Auden. Here's my email address, energywiz@aol.com. That's one that gets directly to my desk, so it doesn't have to go through the village, which has a slow email system. And I will be happy to now answer questions.